Gravatio est. Enigma crudelitas est.
Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose, and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city, and appeared unto many. Now when the centurion and they that were with him watching Jesus saw the earthquake and those things that were done, they feared greatly, saying, Truly this was the Son of God.
Many people want to assume if something wasn't recorded clearly as history, then it's not history. But I would quote a man who said, "There's nothing new in the world except the history you do not know." And that man was President Harry S. Truman, 33rd degree Freemason. The 33rd degree honors the suspected age of Jesus' death. As someone who studies the supernatural, I would not rule out the possibility that the earth stood still.
Now it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. Then the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. This account of Jesus' death in Luke 23 leaves us wondering what exactly caused this darkness. Can this darkness be explained astronomically, or was it a completely supernatural event? Jumping immediately into an astronomical explanation would lead us to suspect a solar eclipse. While an eclipse of the sun may seem to make the most sense, it does not line up with the timing of Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus was crucified at the time of the Passover when the moon was in its full phase. This month-long Passover took place on the 14th day of the month of Nisan, which was then followed by the week-long festival of unleavened bread lasting from the 15th of Nisan to the 21st day of Nisan. According to John 19:14, Jesus died on the day of preparation before the Passover week, which is the 14th of Nisan. Since the moon was at the exact opposite side of its orbit, a solar eclipse would not be possible.
Unless the date was simply wrong and it was not in April during a lunar eclipse. The Catholic Church and Jewish theologians placed the crucifixion to a logical time they thought made sense. For example, many of the holidays in the Catholic Church were placed symbolically to fit to the seasons as a cultural appropriation tactic during the Nicene Council's decisions on that. It's a political persuasion tactic that's marketable and also rational. This is why they placed Easter in spring to represent the resurrection, just as plants rise from the ground. This placement in time gives honor to an event and signifies the importance, but theologians also understand this may not be the actual date. This is also known as the paradox of the Chinese whisper game, where knowledge seems to be passed down from person to person, but over time it can be skewed and reinterpreted. The Romans didn't care to wait for Easter to be in spring, but God can time the event to a certain degree without taking people's free will away. Keep in mind, everything Jesus did was strategic. He planned his death where he knew the outcome. It would have been pretty stupid of Jesus if he appeared in Australia.
There is also another problem with the solar eclipse theory. The Bible says that the darkness lasted 3 hours, but the maximum time that the sun can be eclipsed is only 8 minutes. Since this concept of having darkness while the sun is still shining cannot be explained astronomically, we can come to the conclusion that God himself must have supernaturally brought this on.
But it can be explained astronomically and supernaturally. It can be both, it's not black and white. We should not disconnect the other claim, which is the earthquake, which the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration actually documents as a possible event in history. Now keep in mind, record keeping wasn't very good back then, so there could be dozens of 8.0 earthquakes that go undetected or unrecorded in geological history. The only time a total eclipse was visible in Jerusalem in this era fell later in the year on the 24th of November 29 CE at 11:05 a.m. This is the time I think Jesus actually died. In the account of the crucifixion on the eve of Passover, it says that Jesus was crucified at 9 in the morning, so maybe the only thing they got right really was that he was crucified in the morning. It appears that Luke's gospel originally was trying to explain an event like an eclipse, but many scholars were disagreeing on that. Many theologians agree that the biblical details do not accord with the eclipse, as the solar eclipse could not have occurred on or near Passover when Jesus was crucified, and it would have been too brief to account for 3 hours of darkness, unless they got the date wrong, and God also supernaturally slowed down the speed of the earth from 1,000 miles per hour to 0, which then matched the speed of the moon of at 2,288 miles per hour. It may not have lasted for 3 hours of darkness, but we can put a margin of error of saying between 1 and 3 hours. Keep in mind the number 3 is symbolic, but what would have happened if the Earth's rotation slowed down?
First of all, we have to consider the speed of which our planet rotates at the equator, which is roughly 1,000 miles per hour. A sudden pause would cause everything on the surface of the Earth to suddenly move at a speed of over 1,000 miles per hour, 1,600 kilometers per hour, in a sideways direction. Since the velocity needed to escape the Earth's gravity is over 24,800 miles per hour, everything would stay tacked to the Earth's surface, yet jolted forward. Imagine everything suddenly moving across the planet at 1,000 miles per hour. It wouldn't matter what it was. Everything would experience a sideways deceleration of 3/4 of the Earth's gravity. Suddenly, down would be at an angle of 38 degrees from vertical. The force of suddenly stopping would rip buildings right off their foundations and send them flying across the ground with anything else that isn't solid bedrock, destroying everything in a giant and deadly debris path. But that's not all. This would also include the oceans, which would suddenly slosh sideways across the planet, with waves being miles and miles high, moving at the same velocity. Imagine tsunamis so high you couldn't see the top. Just a wall of water racing towards you at 1,000 miles per hour. Both of these two calamities would be the end of most life as we know it. Although the Earth would stop spinning, the atmosphere would continue to spin at the Earth's same velocity as well, which would create very high winds and very nasty storms. Because the Earth rotates, centrifugal force forces the planet to bulge along the equator. With no rotation, you have no bulge, and without that bulge, all of the extra water held in place along the equator would go rushing back toward the poles. If the Earth stops spinning, you have to take into consideration that the inner core of the Earth is spinning at a faster rate. Just because the surface has slowed down doesn't mean the core of the Earth has stopped too. Our highly volcanic planet might erupt in ways we never imagined, as the tectonic forces above and below enter into a new conflict.
So this would be counterproductive, it seems, for God's larger plan for civilization to enter in the technological enlightenment period. If we believe God is merciful, he might not make the Earth stop in 1 second, but maybe in a period of a half hour or less, which the human body can handle just as you're slowing down in an airplane. But this supernatural intervention would have still caused some earthquakes, just not at the severity level as stopping in 1 second. So maybe God did not allow the Earth to be tidal locked with the moon for over 3 hours, because that may cause more severity and destruction. So God's not going to prioritize symbolism over mercy. It was just enough to nudge people into their faith without too much fear, but also it was a way of God expressing his anger. I might stress a teeny bit of anger and sadness. So I think with the testimonies in the Gospels and even a few outside sources point to a more logical conclusion that the event must have happened on the total eclipse of November 24th, 29 CE at 11:05 a.m., with the planet's rotation supernaturally being slowed down to match the moon's speed over a period of a half hour or so, with the eclipse lasting for about 1 to 3 hours, causing earthquakes. So the effects were natural, but the cause was supernatural. Anthropologically speaking, this seems to make the most logical sense to me as a Catholic. There are also a few outside sources that seem to hint to this hypothesis.
There is still some debate over whether this darkness was supernatural or simply an eclipse. Interestingly, the Greek pagan historian Thales confirms the biblical account that darkness totally covered the land at the time of the Passover in the year we now call AD 32. Now, Thales published this information only 20 years after the resurrection of Christ. While this is a powerful extra-biblical historical confirmation of what happened that day, he believed this darkness to be a result of a solar eclipse.
Now I know people would ask, wouldn't there have been at least some mention of the events outside the Bible? And yes, originally the Gospels were considered news at the time, or underground news. The Bible didn't exist at the time, just the many scrolls of different tribal groups trying to make sense and documenting this event in their perspective, with the many Gnostic Gospels and the four main Gospels. So there were quite a few textual references which was eventually compiled together, but by that time the details may be lost or misinterpreted a little bit. It would not have been in the interest of the Romans to document this event. Anyone who did may have been crucified. We have to understand the politics at the time. History is only written by the victors, and each group who portrays that event may have some biased manner to it. We see this phenomenon in modern-day media. But there are some other outside references, according to Dr. Habermas, one of the world's leading experts on the resurrection. He reported on the historian named Thallus, who in AD 52 wrote a history of the Eastern Mediterranean world since the Trojan War. Although Thallus's work has been lost, it was quoted by Julius Africanus in AD 221, and it may be referencing to the darkness written about in the Gospels. Historian Dr. Edward M. Yamauchi explains in this passage Julius Africanus says Thallus, in the third book of his histories, explains away the darkness as an eclipse of the sun, unreasonably as it may seem to me, end quote, unless something supernatural intervened to slow down the planet's rotation gradually. Yamauchi states, so Thallus apparently was saying, yes, there had been darkness at the time of the crucifixion, and he speculated it had been caused by an eclipse. Africanus then argues that it could not have been an eclipse given when the crucifixion occurred, unless the date was wrong, and the Catholic Church would accept that the holidays were timed with the seasons for symbolic reasons, not necessarily the actual historical dates of the events. Historian Dr. Paul Myers says this about the darkness in the footnotes in the 1968 book, Pontius Pilate. This phenomenon eventually was visible to Rome, Athens, and other Mediterranean cities. According to Tertullian, it was a cosmic or world event. Phlegon, a Greek author from Caria, wrote a chronology soon after in 137 AD, reported that in the fourth year of the 202nd Olympiad in 33 AD, there was the greatest eclipse of the sun, and that it became night in the 6th hour of the day at noon, so the stars even appeared in the heavens. There was a great earthquake in Bithynia, and many things were overturned in Nicaea. Keep in mind the margin of error of Jesus' birth and death could have a 6-year difference. So the timing may appear off due to cultural differences on how they document time. Yamauchi includes, so there is, as Paul Meyer points out, a non-biblical attestation of the darkness that occurred at the time of Jesus' crucifixion apparently. Some found the need to try to give it a natural explanation by saying it was an eclipse. End quote. I think now the question is, did Phlegon get the date wrong of 33 CE or was it 29 CE? I think we can narrow the date down to these two potential solar eclipses. There's also a Jewish prophet or preacher by the name of Amos who also hints at a possible solar eclipse that causes earthquakes.
The book closes with a series of visions that Amos experienced, and they're symbolic depictions of the coming day of the Lord. So he sees Israel devastated by a locust swarm, and then by a scorching fire, and then they're being swallowed up like overripe fruit. And in the final vision, Amos sees God violently striking the pillars of Israel's great idol temple at Bethel, and the whole building comes crumbling down. It's an image of God's justice on the leaders and the gods of Israel. Their end has finally come. But then, all of a sudden, in the final paragraph, we see a glimmer of hope. It picks up this image of Israel as a destroyed building, and God says that out of the ruins, he will one day restore the house of David. In other words, he's going to bring the future Messianic king from David's line, and he will rebuild the family of God's people, which, surprisingly, we're told, is going to include people from all of the nations. All of the devastation caused by Israel's sin and God's judgment will that day be reversed. Now, this final paragraph is super important. It's the only sign of hope on the other side of judgment. And it helps us see how this book is exploring the relationship between God's justice and his mercy.
So Amos, 800 years prior to the crucifixion, declares a stricken son was to occur on midday on the precise day of the only begotten son's death. So maybe this was another hint that there was a solar eclipse as a sign of the Messiah, the day the earth stood still. What do you think of this hypothesis? Leave a comment and have a good Easter.